Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you this morning. The joy of children who bring germs home from school. Lucas had a bit of a cold last weekend, and he passed it on to me, and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday I felt okay, but from Thursday I've had a proper chest infection. And so for me, this is Saturday lunchtime. I thought I'd better just prepare in case I can't be at church. And the fact that you're watching this means that there isn't communion either. I did try to make arrangements for one of my retired colleagues to fill in and help with communion, but that wasn't possible today. So I also didn't want to give anyone the job of reading 41 verses of John chapter 9. John chapter 9, it's a whole chapter of John's Gospel. There are 21 chapters in John's Gospel, and this story is a whole chapter of John. 5% of the whole of the life story of from birth to death and resurrection of Jesus is just this one story. So it's clearly an important story, and we should think about it. It's not in any of the other Gospels, and so we wonder where it came from and how it got to be there and why it's so prominent. Well, Jesus hardly features in the story. Jesus pops up at the beginning and he pops up at the end, but the vast bulk of the story is this ongoing interaction between the man born blind who's healed, his parents, the Pharisees, neighbors, others who are trying to make sense of what happened. Maybe for us, the story is about containers. It's about how we fit new things into old containers. There's a bit of wine in wineskins, that illustration that Jesus uses himself elsewhere in the Gospels. But it's an important story for Lent as we head towards Easter, where we sometimes make the mistake, I think, of assuming that we know what the story is about and we know how it ends and why it ends that way and what it all means, when in fact every year, both around Christmas time, journeying towards that through Advent and Lent towards Easter, we sit in the presence of an enormous mystery. God becoming incarnate, and then somehow Jesus' choices in the last weeks of his life, and the fact of his death, and then the story of his resurrection, that somehow those make very clear for us in ways they weren't before. Possibilities, promises, exploring. Now, as many of you know, I like camping. And one of the things about camping, especially if you go wild camping, is that you only have a certain amount of space to pack things in. And sometimes you get something that comes in a tiny little package, and you think, wow, that's amazing. You take it out, and then you unroll it. I have a sleeping mat that's a bit like that inflatable mat. And it took me about half an hour the first time I unrolled it to test it, to work out how to get it back into its container. This is one of my jackets. It's a down jacket. It's not very heavy. It's full of duck feathers. I believe no ducks were harmed in the making of this. There are ethical standards around those things. But this whole jacket fits into this little bag. And it does. It's not too difficult to get it in the bag. But it is a bit of work. It's much harder sometimes with bigger things. So with things like a tent, where you try to get it back in at the end of your camping trip, and you just can't fit it back in. There's too much of it to fit back into the bag that it came in. And maybe that's a little bit like the struggle of the Pharisees. And again, let's not give them too hard a time. They are precious in a way that isn't precious, if that makes sense, about their faith and about what it looks like and it feels like and what makes it real, what makes it workable, what makes it substantial. And they had this experience, as they do in other places in the Gospels, where Jesus does things and says things that don't fit into that bag. They spill out of it. They're messy. They don't fit into the container. And there's a lot for us to think about as we think about the church going forward. That is about what kind of container we think we're holding. Because we might miss some of what God is doing on the edges of our life, or in whole new places, or asking us to explore that we might not recognize as of God because, well, it just doesn't fit into the container. So in the story, there are nine times the word know appears. No. Not no, but no. Knowledge. And between this man and the Pharisees and his parents and others, they say, oh, we do know, we don't know. There seems to be a lot in the story that is about knowledge, about things that we feel confident that we could say we trust, I suppose. Knowledge is about things that we trust. The whole field of epistemology, if you're interested, is the theory of knowledge. How do you know what you know? Because so many things that we know because someone has told us that we trust it, and we take that for granted, that is true. And many of those things are, pretty much all of them. But every now and then we're surprised by something that we believed was true that isn't. One of the joys of the television program QI is they talk about the half-life of facts. Just on a recent episode that I watched, they talked about something that had been said with great confidence in one of the first series, I think in 2005, which was then corrected and revised about 7 years later, and in this last episode was again because research, because our what we know has changed, and what we can prove has changed. We had to update, had to rethink something we've previously said we know. So the Pharisees know what sin is. I guess that's really what the story is about in some ways. They know how sin works. They've worked that out for themselves. They've stepped into a tradition that has expanded that into an enormous set of rules and regulations and understandings that make it quite clear. And the story begins with this man born blind, the disciples saying to Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents? And Jesus says, neither. This man is is part of God demonstrating what love looks like, who God is, who I am in the world. And then we come back to sin right at the end, when it is the Pharisees who are those throwing the label of sinner at Jesus and at this man and everyone around him and cast him out, that ultimately are shown to be those who are sinning because they make God too small. I don't know what you make of the story. Telling it took 7 and a bit minutes in the video. It's a long reading, so I'm not going to talk for a long time. But I think it is a story about containers, about framing, about what we know, and what we're confident about, what we're sure about, and how we sift and sort experiences and ideas and opportunities that might come our way that don't feel like they fit the container, so as to exclude them, rather than to say, maybe God needs a bigger bag. Maybe God can't be stuffed into this perfectly sized container that we fill with as much of God as we know, as we have done previously. Maybe there's more. This man comes, well, he doesn't come to Jesus, Jesus comes to him. And as Jesus comes to him, his life is made very complicated, at least for a time. And we're not sure what happens to him, because at the end of the story, he has been cast out. He's been excluded. Jesus finds him in his exclusion and helps him to know that he is loved. There is no doubt that the future is uncomfortable, that the best we have known in the church as it's been isn't going to come back the way that it was. And either we decide that the container fits and we will serve the container, we will serve our understanding, our knowing of what God and faith and Methodism and Haxby and Wigginton Methodist Church is, and watch it shrink around us because others don't understand it and don't want to know what it is. Or perhaps like the Pharisees, in that wrestling, we go a step further than them. because they find themselves they find themselves unable to see what is happening as something of God. I worry for our church. I worry for the Methodist Church. I worry for institutional religion, not just Christianity even, because there is always the danger that we've become so bound to the container that we found ourselves in, which has spoken to us and invited us and held us, and we've fitted well, neatly, in ways that have healed us and welcomed us and restored us and given meaning to our lives, that we will hold the container so precious that we perhaps miss what God is doing somewhere else. So this Easter, we don't go through the dutiful, faithful remembering of a story that we think we know and understand, nearly as much as we enter into the mystery of a story that has God come into the world in human flesh and and live for love and die for love and ask us to live for love in ways that go beyond anything we've ever known. I don't know what you make of that invitation, that challenge, what you make of that opportunity, what you make of that message. But let's at least be honest, for all of us, we wrestle with giving up the containers where they have served us well and we know them well and they are comforting, they are part of our identity, they're part of who we are, and because of that we struggle to see beyond them. Let's not be Pharisees, or let's not get stuck in being Pharisees, because we all are in some way. We are wedded to what we know and wedded to what is clear to us and wedded to what we believe. Let's go beyond those men in this story who cannot see, cannot find, cannot even make room for, must condemn that which is not within their container. I wish you well as you journey into the next week. I'm sorry I can't be with you. I'm sorry we can't have communion. But I wanted to share those thoughts with you today and ask you, maybe over coffee, or to just maybe share some stories of times when your life has expanded because things just didn't fit anymore into the container you had. And I hope and pray that our journey towards Easter is full of surprises, because God is in the business of surprising us. May we respond well to whatever surprises there are.